A father stands on a porch and sells his daughter like livestock. That's how this story begins. Not with love, not with protection, but with a public auction that will shatter a 16-year-old girl's world and rebuild it in ways no one could predict. What happens when the man who buys you isn't the monster everyone expects? When freedom looks like captivity, and captivity becomes freedom? Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The summer sun beat down on Dustford like a punishment nobody deserved, but everyone accepted. Heat rose in shimmering waves from the packed dirt of Main Street, distorting the false front buildings until they looked like they might collapse into themselves. 16-year-old Hazel Rusk had learned long ago that this town had two seasons, dust and more dust. Today, standing on the weathered porch of Nolan's General Store, she discovered it had a third season too, humiliation. "Step up here, girl. Let folks get a good look at what I'm offering." Calvin Rusk's voice carried across the street with the kind of volume that suggested he'd been practicing this moment. His calloused hand gripped Hazel's upper arm hard enough to leave marks she'd find later, purple and finger-shaped, like signatures of ownership. She stumbled forward, her worn boots catching on a loose plank. Hazel kept her eyes down, studying those boots with fierce concentration. The left one had a crack along the sole that let in dust with every step. The right one's laces were mismatched, one brown, one black, because Calvin had told her years ago that matching laces were a waste of money on a girl who'd never amount to much anyway. "Now, I know what you're all thinking," Calvin continued, addressing the growing crowd with the practiced ease of a carnival barker. Calvin Rusk's had a hard time with this one. Tried everything a good father could try: discipline, structure, hard work to build character. Hazel's jaw clenched. The lies rolled off his tongue smooth as river stones, polished by repetition until they almost sounded true. But a man can only carry dead weight for so long before it breaks his back. Someone in the crowd, Hazel thought it might be Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, made a small sound of disapproval. Or maybe it was agreement. Hazel had stopped trying to tell the difference years ago. She risked a glance up, just quick enough to catalog the faces. Tom Nolan stood in the doorway of his own store, arms crossed, expression unreadable behind his thick gray beard. The Avery sisters clutched their shopping baskets, eyes wide with the kind of scandalized delight that came from witnessing someone else's misfortune. Three ranch hands from the double bar leaned against the hitching post, snickering behind their hands. Old Pete from the livery sat in his usual chair, whittling, pretending this was just another Tuesday afternoon. "So here's what I'm proposing," Calvin announced, his hand still iron tight on Hazel's arm. "A fair trade. Good for me, good for whoever's man enough to take on a project like this. I need a Winchester rifle, the model with the octagonal barrel, if Nolan's still got one in stock, and 6 sacks of flour. That's my price." The murmuring in the crowd shifted, grew louder. Hazel felt heat flood her face, burning hotter than the summer sun. She was being traded, publicly, for a gun and flour, not even expensive flour. "You can't be serious, Calvin." That was Tom Nolan, stepping fully out of his store now, his face reddening. "That's your daughter you're talking about, not a—" "My daughter stopped being my concern the day she made it clear she'd never be useful," Calvin interrupted smoothly. "I've got 3 boys at home who actually earn their keep. She's just taking up space and eating food that could go to someone productive." Hazel's fingernails dug into her palms. "Don't cry. Don't you dare cry in front of them." "Besides," Calvin added, his voice dropping into something that might have sounded like regret if you didn't know him better, "it's not like she's got prospects here anyway. Look at her." Hazel didn't need to look. She knew what they saw. A girl too tall and too angular, all sharp elbows and prominent collarbones. Mousy brown hair that never held a curl, no matter how much she tried. Eyes an indeterminate gray-green that couldn't decide what they wanted to be. A face that was memorable only in its unremarkableness. And a body that Calvin had spent 16 years informing her was shapeless as a fence post and about as appealing. "No man in Dustford's going to court her," Calvin continued, warming to his theme now. "So I'm offering someone the chance to get some use out of her. She can cook, adequately. She can clean. She's strong enough for farm work if you keep her at it. And she's young enough to be trained up proper by someone with more patience than I've got." The silence that followed was worse than the murmuring. It meant people were actually considering it. Hazel's vision blurred. The crowd became a smear of colors, brown and gray and faded calico. The sun pressed down like a physical weight. Her throat felt tight, her chest tighter. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But of course it was happening. This was Calvin Rusk. This was Dustford. This was her life, reduced to its essential truth. She was worth exactly 1 rifle and 6 sacks of flour. I'll throw in her mother's old quilt, Calvin added, as if sweetening an already generous deal. Real nice patchwork. Hazel made it actually, so you know she can sew. The quilt. Hazel's hands had bled making that quilt, fingers raw from pushing the needle through layers of fabric salvaged from worn-out dresses and shirts. She'd worked on it for 2 years, every stitch perfect, every pattern carefully planned. Calvin had told her it was practice for when she'd need to make herself useful to a husband. She'd never imagined he meant it like this. "This is barbaric!" June Avery's voice cut through the crowd, sharp and clear. She was the younger of the Avery sisters, the one with more spine than sense, according to local gossip. "You can't just sell a person, Calvin. This isn't—" "I'm not selling her," Calvin corrected, his voice hardening. "I'm making a trade. Perfectly legal. She's my daughter, under my legal guardianship until she's 18 or married. I've got every right to arrange her future as I see fit." "Arrange her future?" June's laugh was bitter. "You're auctioning her off like a man making practical decisions," Calvin finished. "Something you might understand if you'd ever had to provide for 4 children on ranch wages." The crowd's sympathy, which had been wavering toward June, swung back toward Calvin. That was his gift. The ability to make cruelty sound like common sense. Hazel felt something inside her begin to crack. Not her heart. That had been cracking for years, each small fracture catalogued and endured. This was something deeper, something fundamental. The part of her that had kept hoping things might get better, that someone might intervene, that she might wake up tomorrow and discover this was all a terrible dream. That part shattered. "I'll take her." The voice came from the back of the crowd, quiet but clear. Everyone turned. Hazel turned too, though her vision was still swimming with unshed tears. A man stood at the edge of the gathering, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by wind and sun into something ageless and unreadable. He wore clothes that looked handmade: buckskin pants, a homespun shirt, a leather vest that had seen better decades. His hair was dark, shot through with gray, pulled back from his face. His eyes were the blue-gray of storm clouds, and they fixed on Calvin with an intensity that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. "Silas Crow," someone whispered, and the name rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Hazel knew the name. Everyone in Dustford knew the name, though few could claim to actually know the man. Silas Crow was the mountain hermit, the recluse who lived somewhere up in the high country and came down maybe 4 times a year for supplies. There were stories about him, dark stories, whispered stories, the kind that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said he'd killed a man in a duel back east. Others claimed he'd been a soldier who'd seen too much war and couldn't bear civilization anymore. A few insisted he practiced some kind of old magic up in those mountains, that he could call down storms and speak to animals. Hazel had seen him exactly 3 times in her life, always from a distance, always moving through town like smoke, present but intangible, there and gone before you could really look at him. Now he was looking at her. "You'll take her?" Calvin's eyebrows rose, his grip finally loosening on Hazel's arm. "You got the goods I asked for?" Silas's gaze didn't leave Calvin's face. "Nolan can provide the rifle and flour. I'll pay him fair price. You'll sign papers releasing her into my custody." "Papers?" Calvin laughed. "This ain't the city, Crow. My word's good enough." "Papers," Silas repeated, his voice level and immovable as bedrock. "With witnesses, legal and binding." Something flickered across Calvin's face. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation, but he nodded. "Fine. Tom, you got those things in stock?" Tom Nolan looked between the 2 men, his expression deeply troubled. "I do, but then let's conduct business like civilized people," Calvin said, all charm now. "Crow here wants to make an honest trade. Who am I to stand in his way?" The next 20 minutes passed in a blur for Hazel. Tom Nolan disappeared into his store and emerged with a Winchester rifle and a handwritten bill of sale. Silas counted out money, actual silver dollars more than Hazel had ever seen in one place. Calvin examined the rifle with greedy care, working the lever action, checking the bore, nodding with satisfaction. June Avery appeared at Hazel's side, pressing something into her hand. "Your sketchbook," she whispered. "You left it on the bench last week. I kept it safe." Hazel's fingers closed around the small, leather-bound journal. Inside were dozens of drawings, wildflowers mostly, and birds, and the shapes of clouds. The only beautiful things she'd been able to create in this ugly place. "Thank you," Hazel managed, her voice barely audible. "If you need help," June started, but Calvin's voice cut across whatever she'd been about to say. "All done here. Hazel, get your things." "I'm wearing my things," Hazel said quietly. Calvin looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Saves me the trouble of packing. Crow, she's all yours. Don't come crying to me when you figure out what a burden she is." Silas moved through the crowd with the same quiet presence he'd maintained throughout the whole exchange. Up close, Hazel could see the lines around his eyes, the scars on his hands, the way he held himself with the careful stillness of someone who'd learned to take up exactly as much space as needed and no more. "Can you walk?" he asked her. Such a simple question, such a strange question, as if walking was optional, as if she might have a choice in what happened next. "Yes," she whispered. "Then come. Wagon's around back." Hazel looked at Calvin one last time. Her father, the man who'd raised her, fed her, sheltered her, and today sold her for a rifle and some flour. He was already admiring his new Winchester, running his hand along the barrel, smiling with the satisfaction of a man who'd made a good deal. He didn't look at her again. She followed Silas Crow around the side of the general store, past the water trough where flies buzzed in the afternoon heat, to where a sturdy wagon waited in the shade. 2 horses stood in their traces, one dappled gray, one solid brown, both looking better cared for than any animal Calvin had ever owned. Silas opened the back of the wagon, revealing a neat arrangement of supplies, sacks of grain, coils of rope, tools wrapped in oiled cloth. He pulled out a worn blanket and spread it over the tailgate. "You can ride back here or up front with me," he said. "Your choice." Another choice. Another strange offer of agency. Hazel looked at the wagon bed, then at the seat beside Silas, then back at the town she'd lived in all her life. Through the gap between buildings, she could see Main Street, still populated by people who'd just watched her be traded away and done nothing. Back here, she decided. At least there, she wouldn't have to try to make conversation. Silas nodded once and offered his hand to help her climb up. His grip was firm but not bruising, and he released her the moment she was settled. "There's water in the canteen," he said, pointing to a leather container tied to the side of the wagon. "And dried fruit in the small sack there. We've got about 4 hours ahead of us." 4 hours. 4 hours to where? But Hazel didn't ask. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and made herself as small as possible as Silas climbed onto the driver's seat and clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon rolled forward, wheels creaking, supplies shifting with each bump and rut. Hazel watched Dustford recede behind them. The general store, the church with its crooked steeple, the boarding house, the livery, the saloon. The buildings got smaller and smaller, their edges softening in the dust and heat until they looked like a child's toys, meaningless and far away. She didn't cry. She'd learned years ago that crying changed nothing, but she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, let it settle into her bones alongside all the other heavy truths she carried. The road climbed. At first gradually, almost imperceptibly, then with more insistence. The prairie grass gave way to scrub brush, then to juniper and pinyon pine. The air shifted, growing cooler, thinner. The horses leaned into their work, muscles bunching under their coats as the grade increased. Hazel lost track of time. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening, the light turning golden and then amber. They passed a creek where Silas stopped to water the horses. He offered her water again, and this time she took it, drinking deeply from the canteen. The water was cold and clean, tasting of minerals and mountain snow. "We're about halfway," Silas said. It was the first time he'd spoken since they left Dustford. Hazel nodded, not trusting her voice. They climbed higher. The road, barely more than a track now, wound through stands of ponderosa pine that smelled like vanilla and sunshine. Hazel spotted a hawk circling overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. She wished she'd brought out her sketchbook, but it felt wrong to draw beautiful things right now, when everything inside her felt ugly and broken. The sun touched the western peaks, painting them in shades of rose and gold. Silas guided the wagon off the main track onto something even narrower, following a path that seemed to exist more in his memory than in physical reality. Tree branches brushed the sides of the wagon. Somewhere nearby, Hazel heard running water. "Nearly there," Silas said. Hazel's stomach clenched. Nearly where? What waited for her at the end of this journey? She'd been so numb with shock and grief that she hadn't let herself think about what came next. Now, as darkness gathered between the trees and the temperature dropped, reality began to assert itself. She was alone in the wilderness with a strange man. A recluse. Someone about whom terrible stories were told. He'd bought her, no, traded for her, and now she was his. His what? His servant? His prisoner? His... Hazel's mind shied away from that thought, but it came back, insistent and terrifying. The wagon emerged into a clearing just as the last light drained from the sky. Hazel saw the shape of a cabin, low and solid, built from logs that looked like they'd grown here. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. A lean-to shelter stood off to one side, and beyond it, Hazel could make out the dark shapes of a vegetable garden and what might be a chicken coop. Silas set the brake and climbed down. He stood for a moment looking at his home with something like relief in his posture, then turned to help Hazel from the wagon. She accepted his hand because she had no choice, and because her legs had gone stiff from the long ride. When her feet touched the ground, they nearly buckled. Silas steadied her with a hand on her elbow, then immediately let go. "Cabin's warmer than it looks," he said. "I'll get a fire going, then see to the horses." He walked to the door, pushed it open, and gestured for her to enter. Hazel stood frozen. This was it. This was the moment. Whatever came next would happen behind that door, in that dark cabin, with no witnesses and no way to escape. "Go on," Silas said, his voice gentle. "You must be cold." Cold? Yes. She was shaking, though whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. She stepped through the doorway. The interior was dark, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs. Hazel stood just inside, afraid to move deeper, afraid to touch anything. She heard Silas behind her striking flint, coaxing spark to tinder. Light bloomed, first in the fireplace, then from a candle he lit and placed on a rough-hewn table. The cabin was simple but not crude. One large room with a sleeping loft above reached by a ladder, a table and 2 chairs, a dry sink, shelves holding dishes, jars of preserved food, books, a rocking chair near the fireplace. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters. The floor was swept clean. Everything had its place. "The loft's yours," Silas said, feeding larger pieces of wood into the fire. "I sleep down here. There's blankets up there already, and I'll bring up that quilt your father mentioned." Hazel's mind struggled to process this. The loft was hers? Where did he sleep? As if reading her confusion, Silas gestured to a thick bedroll tucked in the corner near the fireplace. "That's my place. Has been for years. Don't need much." "I don't understand," Hazel whispered. Silas straightened, brushing wood chips from his hands. He looked at her directly for the first time since they'd arrived, and his eyes held something Hazel couldn't quite name. "What don't you understand?" he asked. Why you traded for me? What you want from me?" The words hung in the air between them, weighted with all the terrible possibilities Hazel had been imagining for the past 4 hours. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out one of the chairs and sat down, gesturing to the other. "Sit," he said. "Please." Hazel sat. The chair was solid, well-made, comfortable. "I came down to Dustford today to get supplies," Silas began, his voice low and measured. "Heard the commotion on Main Street. Walked over to see what the fuss was about. Saw your father selling you like livestock, saw the way he grabbed you, saw the look on your face." He paused, staring into the growing fire. "I had a daughter once," he continued, "long time ago. She'd be about your age now, if she'd lived." The past tense hit Hazel like a physical blow. Had a daughter. "I couldn't stop what happened to her," Silas said quietly. "Couldn't protect her when it mattered. But I saw you on that porch today, and I thought, here's something I can stop. Here's someone I can protect, so I did." Hazel's throat burned with unshed tears. You don't know me. No, Silas agreed. And you don't know me. But I know what I saw. I know what your father was doing. And I know that you deserve better than being traded for a rifle. What do you want from me? Hazel asked again, needing to hear it plainly. Silas met her eyes. I want you to be safe. I want you to have a place to sleep and food to eat, and time to figure out who you are without someone telling you you're worthless. That's all. That's not how trades work, Hazel said bitterly. You gave him money and goods. You're not supposed to do anything except be here, Silas interrupted firmly. I'm not your father. I'm not your owner. I'm just someone who had the means to get you out of a bad situation and thought I should use those means. If that offends your sense of how trades work, then we can call it something else. Call it a rescue. Call it charity. Call it an old man's penance. I don't care what you call it, as long as you understand that you're safe here. Hazel wanted to believe him, desperately wanted to believe him, but she'd learned that men said one thing and meant another, that kindness was often just cruelty waiting for the right moment. I need to see to the horses, Silas said, standing. There's bread and cheese on the shelf there, and dried venison. Help yourself to whatever you want. I'll be back in about 30 minutes. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. One more thing, he said without turning around. The loft's yours. So's your body, your choices, your time. Nobody touches you here. Nobody hurts you here. That's a promise I aim to keep. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Hazel sat in the firelight, listening to her own breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man who'd bought her had just told her she was free. The stranger who'd brought her to an isolated cabin had just promised her safety. It made no sense. It violated everything she knew about how the world worked. But as the fire crackled and warmth seeped into her cold bones, Hazel felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that might, possibly, if she dared to name it, be hope. She stood on shaking legs and climbed the ladder to the loft. The space was small but clean, with a real bed, not just a pallet on the floor like she'd had at Calvin's, covered in thick blankets. A small window looked out over the clearing. Moonlight filtered through the pines, silver and peaceful. Hazel sat on the bed. The mattress gave beneath her weight, stuffed with something that smelled like fresh hay and dried lavender. She pulled the sketchbook from her pocket and opened it to a random page, a drawing of columbine flowers she'd found growing by the creek last spring. Outside, she heard Silas talking softly to the horses, his voice a low rumble that somehow made the night feel safer instead of more threatening. For the first time in 16 years, Hazel allowed herself to imagine that tomorrow might be different than yesterday. The fire burned low, the stars wheeled overhead, and in the loft of a mountain cabin, a girl who'd been sold for a rifle and 6 sacks of flour finally let herself cry, not from fear or grief, but from the exhausting, overwhelming possibility that maybe, just maybe, she'd been rescued after all. Hazel woke to birdsong and the smell of coffee. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn logs instead of cracked plaster. The mattress beneath her was soft instead of lumpy. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke instead of dust and disappointment. Then memory crashed back. The porch, the trade, the wagon ride. Silas Crow. She sat up quickly, heart hammering, and looked around the loft. Morning light streamed through the small window, painting everything in shades of gold. Her sketchbook lay where she'd left it on the bedside table. An actual table, not just a crate turned on its side. The quilt Calvin had mentioned was folded at the foot of the bed, its careful stitches mocking her with memories of the hours she'd spent making something beautiful for a man who'd sold her. Below she heard movement, the clink of a pot, footsteps, the creak of the door opening and closing. Hazel climbed down the ladder on silent feet, her body stiff from the long wagon ride. The main room was empty, the fire banked to coals, but a pot of coffee sat warming on the edge of the hearth. 2 tin cups waited on the table beside a plate of biscuits that looked fresh-baked. The door stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, Hazel could see Silas outside, splitting wood with the kind of steady rhythm that suggested he'd been at it for a while. He'd removed his vest, and his homespun shirt clung to his back, dark with sweat despite the cool morning air. Hazel poured herself coffee with shaking hands and retreated to the rocking chair by the fireplace. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the weak, overboiled stuff Calvin made. She wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth seep into her palms. The door swung open wider, and Silas entered carrying an armload of split wood. He stopped when he saw her, then nodded once. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "You find the coffee?" "Yes, thank you." He stacked the wood by the fireplace with careful precision, each piece placed just so. "Biscuits are there if you're hungry. Made them before dawn. They're better hot, but they'll keep." Hazel watched him move through the cabin, economical and sure. Every action had purpose. No wasted motion. He washed his hands in a basin, dried them on a cloth, then poured his own coffee and sat at the table. "Got work to do today," he said, not looking at her. "Goats need milking, chickens need feeding, and their coop needs mucking out. Garden needs weeding. The beans are trying to choke out the tomatoes. After that, I need to check the fence line on the east pasture." He paused, took a sip of coffee. "You can help with any of that if you want. Or you can stay here. Or you can walk the property and get your bearings. Your choice." There was that word again, choice. "I'll help," Hazel heard herself say. Silas looked at her then, his storm cloud eyes searching her face. "You don't have to." "I know, but I'd rather be useful than sit here wondering what you're thinking." Something that might have been sadness flickered across his face. "Fair enough. Finish your coffee first. Then I'll show you where things are." The goats were kept in a sturdy pen behind the cabin, 3 does and a young buck, all of them alert and curious when Silas approached. He moved among them with easy familiarity, running his hands along their flanks, checking their hooves, murmuring words Hazel couldn't quite catch. "This is Pepper," he said, indicating a doe with a white blaze on her forehead. "She's the boss. The other 2 are Clove and Nutmeg. The buck's called Sage, but don't let him fool you. He's more trouble than wisdom." Hazel watched as Silas demonstrated milking, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he coaxed milk into the pail with steady pulls. The rhythmic sound was soothing, almost hypnotic. "Want to try?" he asked. Hazel knelt in the dirt beside him. Pepper eyed her with mild suspicion, but didn't move. Hazel reached out tentatively, positioned her hands the way Silas had shown, and pulled. Nothing happened. "Firmer," Silas coached. "She won't break. Steady pressure like this." He guided her hands once, his touch brief and impersonal, then let go. Hazel tried again, and this time a thin stream of milk hit the pail. "There you go," Silas said, and Hazel thought she heard approval in his voice. They worked in silence for a while, the morning sun warming Hazel's back, the goats chewing contentedly on hay. It was peaceful in a way Hazel had never experienced. At Calvin's ranch, every chore had been accompanied by criticism, by comments about how slowly she worked or how poorly she did things. Here, there was just the work itself, and the quiet presence of a man who seemed content to let her figure things out. The chickens were equally straightforward. Silas showed her where the feed was kept, how much to scatter, how to check the nesting boxes for eggs. The birds clucked and bustled around her feet, and Hazel found herself smiling despite everything when one particularly bold hen perched on her boot. "That's Bess," Silas said. "She's fearless, also a terrible mother. Sits on her eggs for exactly 3 days, then gets bored and wanders off. Why keep her if she doesn't raise chicks?" "Because she lays an egg every single day without fail, and her eggs are the biggest of the flock. Everyone's got their strengths." It was such a simple statement, but it lodged in Hazel's chest like a seed. Everyone's got their strengths. Even Bess, the terrible mother. Even Hazel, the fence post daughter. The garden was a revelation. Neat rows of vegetables stretched across a plot that had been cleared from the forest, the soil dark and rich. Tomatoes climbed wooden stakes, their vines heavy with green fruit. Beans wound around poles in tight spirals. Squash plants spread their broad leaves like green umbrellas. Hazel saw carrots, onions, lettuce, herbs she couldn't name. "This is incredible," she breathed. Silas shrugged. "It's food. Can't live on venison and biscuits alone." He handed her a basket and showed her which weeds to pull, which plants needed water, which tomatoes were ready to pick. Hazel worked carefully, afraid of making mistakes, but Silas didn't hover or correct her. He simply worked alongside her, and when she pulled the wrong plant by accident, he just said, "That was a beet seedling, but there's plenty more. You'll learn which is which." You'll learn. As if there would be time for learning, as if she'd be here long enough for it to matter. They worked through the morning, breaking only for water and a brief rest in the shade. Silas moved through his tasks with the easy competence of someone who'd been doing them for years, but Hazel noticed he never rushed her, never made her feel slow or stupid. When she struggled to lift a full water bucket, he simply appeared at her side and said, "2 trips are smarter than 1 spill," and helped her pour half into another container. By midday, Hazel's arms ached and her back complained, but it was a good ache, an honest one, the kind that came from work that mattered. "There's a creek down the path about 50 yards, Silas said, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "If you want to wash up before lunch, the water's cold but clean." Hazel followed the narrow trail through the pines until she heard running water. The creek was exactly as Silas described, cold enough to make her gasp when she knelt beside it, but so clear she could see every pebble on the bottom. She washed her face and hands, letting the icy water shock away the morning's fatigue. When she returned to the cabin, Silas had laid out bread, cheese, and sliced tomatoes on the table. They ate in comfortable silence, and Hazel realized with a start that this was the first meal she'd shared with someone who wasn't criticizing her table manners or telling her she was eating too much. "This afternoon I need to check the fence line," Silas said, pushing his plate away. "It's a long walk, and the terrain's rough. You can come if you want, or you can rest here." Hazel thought about the loft, the comfortable bed, the chance to be alone with her swirling thoughts. Then she thought about being alone in an unfamiliar place while Silas was gone for hours. "I'll come," she said. The walk was indeed long and rough. They followed game trails through dense forest, climbing over fallen logs and scrambling up rocky slopes. Silas moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who knew every inch of this land, while Hazel struggled to keep up, her boots slipping on loose stones, her breath coming hard in the thin mountain air. But Silas never complained about her pace. He simply adjusted his own, waiting when she needed to catch her breath, offering his hand over difficult sections without making it feel like weakness. The fence when they reached it was simple, just wire strung between posts, but it marked something important. Beyond it, the forest opened into a meadow where Hazel could see deer grazing. "This is the eastern boundary of the property," Silas explained. "Keeps the deer from getting too comfortable near the garden, but lets them pass through to water. The whole property is about 40 acres. This fence, then the creek to the west, the big rock outcrop to the north, and the road we came in on to the south." 40 acres. Hazel tried to picture it and failed. The largest thing she'd ever owned was that sketchbook. They walked the fence line, Silas checking each post, tightening wire where it had loosened, replacing sections damaged by weather or animals. Hazel helped where she could, handing him tools, holding posts steady while he worked. "Why do you live up here?" she asked suddenly. "All alone, so far from town." Silas was quiet for so long Hazel thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sat back on his heels and looked out over the meadow. "Town doesn't suit me anymore," he said finally. "Too much noise. Too many people wanting things from you, expecting things. Up here, life's simpler. The goats don't care about your past. The garden doesn't judge your choices. The forest just is. Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes." He stood, brushed dirt from his pants. "But lonely's better than a lot of other things, and I'm not completely isolated. Martha Keene comes up every few weeks with medical supplies and news. The Stone Creek people live about half a day's ride north. They're good neighbors when you need them." The Stone Creek people? Small community. Mix of Cherokee, Creek, and others who've been pushed out of everywhere else. They've got treaty land that borders mine. We look after each other. They continued along the fence line. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything in amber and shadow. Hazel's legs trembled with fatigue, but she didn't complain. This was still better than any afternoon she'd spent in Dustford. "Can I ask you something?" Hazel said as they turned back toward the cabin. "You just did, but go ahead." "What happened to your daughter?" Silas stopped walking. For a moment, Hazel thought she'd crossed some invisible line, asked the one question that was forbidden. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Silas spoke first. "Sickness," he said, the word flat and hard. "Her mother, too. Winter of 1867. I was working in a lumber camp 2 days' ride away. By the time I got the message and made it home, they were both gone. Buried in frozen ground under a sky that didn't give a damn." The grief in his voice was old, but not forgotten. like a scar that still ached in cold weather. "I'm sorry," Hazel whispered. "Me too." Silas started walking again, his pace faster now, as if he could outrun the memories. After that, I couldn't stay in the place where they'd lived, couldn't walk past their rooms, couldn't sit at the table where we'd eaten, couldn't sleep in the bed we'd shared. So I came up here, built the cabin with my own hands, made a new life that didn't include all those ghosts. "But they're still with you," Hazel said softly. "The ghost." Silas looked at her, and in his eyes, Hazel saw recognition, the understanding that came from shared pain. "Yeah, they're still with me. But up here, at least I can breathe around them." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it felt different now. Less like stranger and captive, more like two people who'd both survived things that should have broken them. That evening, Silas taught Hazel how to make cornbread in the Dutch oven, showing her how to test the heat with her hand, how to know when the bread was done by the sound it made when tapped. They ate with venison stew he pulled from the cold cellar, and Hazel realized she was genuinely hungry in a way that felt healthy instead of desperate. After dinner, Silas settled into his rocking chair with a book while Hazel climbed to the loft. She lit the small oil lamp on her bedside table and opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. Outside the window, stars were beginning to appear, brighter than any she'd seen in Dusford, uncounted and impossibly beautiful. She began to sketch the view from her window, the dark silhouettes of pines, the silver edge of moonlight, the vast sweep of sky. Her hand moved across the page with growing confidence, capturing the peace she felt despite all the uncertainty. Below, she heard the creak of Silas's rocking chair, steady and soothing. For the first time in her life, Hazel fell asleep feeling safe. The days developed a rhythm. Hazel woke to birdsong, helped with the morning chores, worked in the garden, learned the 100 small skills required to live in the mountains. Silas was a patient teacher, never mocking her mistakes, always willing to show her something 2 or 3 times until she got it right. She learned to tell when the bread was ready by smell, learned which plants were safe to eat and which would make you sick, learned how to tell if a goat was feeling poorly by the way she held her ears, learned to read the sky for weather, the forest for wildlife, the creek for the passage of time. She also learned about Silas through observation. He was a man of routines and rituals, coffee at dawn, chores in a specific order, lunch when the sun was directly overhead, an hour of reading before bed. He kept the cabin obsessively clean but didn't fuss about small messes. He talked to the animals like they were people and treated people with the same quiet respect he gave everything else. And he never, ever touched her without permission or necessity. A week passed, then 2. Hazel's body began to change. The constant work built muscles she'd never had. Her hands developed calluses. Her skin bronzed from hours in the sun. She felt stronger, sturdier, more solid in her own bones. But she also felt the weight of waiting for Silas to reveal his true intentions, waiting for the cruelty to begin, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was Martha Keene who finally disrupted the pattern. Hazel was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see a sturdy woman on a mule, with a pack mule following behind, picking her way up the trail to the cabin. Silas emerged from the chicken coop, saw the visitor, and smiled, an expression Hazel had rarely seen on his face. "Martha," he called, "you're early this month." "Felt like a ride," Martha replied, swinging down from her mule with surprising agility for a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She was broad-shouldered and strong-featured, with iron gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes found Hazel immediately. "And who's this?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "This is Hazel," Silas said. "She's staying with me for a while." "Staying with you?" Martha's eyebrows rose. "That's so." Hazel stood frozen, dirt on her hands and knees, waiting to be judged. Martha walked over to her, studying her with the clinical assessment of someone used to evaluating situations quickly. "Hazel Rusk," Martha said. It wasn't a question. Hazel nodded mutely. "Heard about you," Martha continued. "Heard your father traded you to Silas here for a rifle and some flour. Whole town's been buzzing about it for 2 weeks." Shame flooded through Hazel, hot and familiar. Of course the town was talking. Of course this was entertainment for them. But Martha's expression wasn't judgmental. If anything, it was angry. "Your father's a piece of work," she said bluntly, "trading his own daughter like livestock. No wonder you look scared." "I'm not scared," Hazel lied. "Yes, you are. And you've got good reason to be. Coming up here with a strange man, not knowing what to expect." Martha turned to Silas. "Can I talk to her? Alone?" Silas nodded without hesitation. "I need to unload those supplies anyway. Take your time." He led the mules toward the lean-to, leaving Hazel alone with Martha. "Come sit," Martha said, gesturing to a bench Silas had built near the garden. "Let's talk plain." Hazel sat. Martha settled beside her with a grunt. "I'm a healer," Martha began. "Been doctoring folks in these mountains for 40 years. I know Silas Crow better than most people, and I know his story. Do you know it?" "He told me about his wife and daughter, how they died." "Did he tell you what kind of man he was before that? What kind of man he is now?" Hazel shook her head. "Silas was a good husband and a good father," Martha said. "Gentle, patient. The kind of man who'd walk 5 miles in a snowstorm to get medicine for a sick child. When he lost his family, it broke something in him. But it didn't break him mean, it broke him quiet." She paused, looking out at the mountains. "I've been coming up here since he built this cabin. Bringing supplies, bringing news, checking to make sure he hasn't frozen to death or gone completely feral. In all those years, I've never seen him be cruel, never seen him raise his voice, never seen him take more than he needs or hurt anything weaker than himself." "Why are you telling me this?" Hazel asked. "Because I can see you're waiting for the monster to show up," Martha said gently. "And I want you to know there's no monster here. Silas brought you up here to keep you safe, and that's all. He won't touch you. Won't hurt you, won't force you into anything you don't want." Hazel felt tears prick her eyes. "How can you be sure?" "Because I know him, and because if he ever did anything to betray that trust, I'd shoot him myself." Martha's voice was utterly calm, utterly certain. "But I won't have to, because Silas Crow is one of the few genuinely good men I've met in this hard world." The tears spilled over then, and Hazel couldn't stop them. All the fear and uncertainty of the past 2 weeks came pouring out in great gasping sobs. Martha pulled her close, and Hazel let herself be held by the stranger who smelled like sage and horse and something medicinal. "There now," Martha murmured. "Let it out. You've earned these tears." When Hazel finally quieted, Martha pulled a handkerchief from her pocket and handed it over. "Better?" she asked. "A little," Hazel admitted, wiping her face. "Good. Now I need to tell you something else, and it's not pleasant." Hazel's stomach clenched. "What?" "Your father's been talking in town, spreading stories, saying Silas forced the trade, that you were taken against your will, that terrible things are happening up here. That's not true." "I know it's not true. You know it's not true. But Calvin's got a silver tongue, and people in Dustford don't ask too many questions when the story's juicy enough." Martha's expression hardened. "He's building a case in the court of public opinion, getting people riled up. I don't know what his endgame is, but nothing good comes from a man like Calvin working that hard to control a narrative." Fear, different from before, settled in Hazel's chest. "What should we do?" "For now, nothing. Live your life. Be safe. Let Silas teach you what he knows, but be prepared for trouble. Men like your father don't let go easily, especially when they think they've been made to look foolish." Martha stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. "Now, come help me unload these supplies, and I'll teach you how to make a proper poultice. Every woman should know how to treat wounds, up here especially." They spent the afternoon in the cabin, Martha showing Hazel her collection of remedies, tinctures and salves and dried herbs, each with its own purpose and preparation. Silas stayed outside, giving them space, but Hazel could hear him working, the steady rhythm of his labor a kind of reassurance. As the sun lowered, Martha prepared to leave. She pulled Hazel aside one more time. "You've got a choice ahead of you," she said quietly. "You can stay here where you're safe, but isolated, or you can eventually go back out into the world. Either way, you need to get strong, not just in body, but in spirit. Don't let what your father did define who you become." "What if I don't know who I am without all that?" Hazel asked. "Then you get to find out. That's the gift Silas gave you, time and space to discover yourself." Martha squeezed her shoulder. "Use it well." After Martha left, Hazel found Silas repairing a section of the chicken coop. She stood watching him for a moment, gathering courage. "Martha told me what my father's been saying in town," she said finally. Silas didn't look up from his work. Figured she would. "Aren't you worried? About what people think? No. About what they might do?" He set down his hammer and met her eyes. "Always. But worry doesn't change preparation. We keep living, keep working, and we deal with problems when they arrive, not before." "How can you be so calm?" "Because panic helps nothing and hurts everything." He picked up the hammer again. "Besides, the truth's on our side. That counts for something." "Does it? In Dustford?" "Maybe not. But there are other truths besides what people in Dustford believe. There's the truth of whether you're safe here, the truth of whether you're being cared for, the truth of whether you're free to leave if you want." He paused, looking at her directly. "You are free to leave, you know. If you want to go back or go somewhere else, I won't stop you. I'll help you. Give you supplies, money, whatever you need." The offer hung in the air between them, genuine and terrifying. "I don't want to leave," Hazel heard herself say. "Then you don't have to. But I needed you to know the option exists." That night, Hazel lay in the loft listening to the forest sounds, owl calls and wind in the pines and the distant howl of coyotes. The lamp burned low beside her bed, casting shadows that danced across the ceiling. She thought about choices and freedom and the strange, unexpected safety she'd found in this isolated cabin with a grieving hermit who asked nothing of her except that she exist. Below, Silas's rocking chair creaked its familiar rhythm. Hazel picked up her sketchbook and began to draw. Not the view from her window this time, but a portrait. Silas's face emerged from the page in careful strokes of charcoal, the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the quiet strength in his expression. But most of all, she captured his eyes, those storm cloud eyes that held old pain and present kindness in equal measure. She was still drawing when sleep finally claimed her. The charcoal smudged on her fingers, the lamp burning low, and somewhere deep in her chest, a small seed of something that felt almost like belonging beginning to take root. Exploded across the meadows in riots of color, lupine and paintbrush, columbine and aster. Hazel filled page after page of her sketchbook with their delicate forms, her hand growing surer with each drawing. She'd been at the cabin for 6 weeks now, and her body had transformed. Muscles defined her arms and shoulders. Her skin had bronzed to gold. She could carry 2 full water buckets without stopping, split kindling without blistering her hands, and read the weather in the clouds with surprising accuracy. But more than her body had changed, something inside her had begun to unfurl, like a plant too long kept in darkness finally reaching toward light. It was Silas who suggested the gathering. They were working in the garden, staking tomato plants that had grown unruly in the June heat, when he mentioned it casually. "Stone Creek's having their summer gathering next weekend, thought we might go." Hazel's hand stilled on the twine she'd been tying. "A gathering?" "Once a year, everyone comes together. Food, music, stories. It's good." He paused, glancing at her. "But only if you want to. No pressure." The thought of people, crowds, strangers, judgment sent a spike of anxiety through Hazel's chest. But underneath the fear was something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or loneliness she hadn't wanted to admit. "Will Martha be there?" "Always is. She brings her medicines and trades for supplies." Silas drove another stake into the ground with practiced efficiency. "The Stone Creek people are good folks, fair. They don't ask questions that aren't their business." "What would I do there?" "Whatever you want. Help with cooking if that suits you. Listen to stories, walk around. Or just sit and watch. There's no wrong way to be at a gathering." Hazel thought about it while they finished the staking. The idea terrified her, but staying in the cabin forever terrified her more. What kind of life was that, hiding from the world? "I'll go," she said finally. "If you think it's safe." "Safer than most places," Silas replied. "And if you change your mind on the way there, we turn around. No shame in that." They left before dawn on Saturday, the wagon packed with supplies Silas planned to trade: preserved venison, goat cheese wrapped in cloth, a dozen eggs cushioned in straw. Hazel wore her cleanest dress, mended and let out at the seams with fabric Martha had brought on her last visit. It still wasn't much, but it was better than the rags she'd arrived in. The journey took them north through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. Silas navigated by landmarks Hazel was only beginning to recognize: a lightning-struck pine, a formation of rocks that resembled a sleeping bear, a creek crossing where the water ran copper-colored over rust-stained stones. "How much farther?" Hazel asked as they climbed a particularly steep section. "Another hour, maybe less. You'll hear it before you see it." He was right. As they crested a ridge, sound drifted up through the trees. Voices and laughter, the bark of dogs, the irregular rhythm of drums. Hazel's heart began to race. The settlement appeared below them, nestled in a valley where two creeks converged. It was larger than Hazel had imagined, maybe 20 permanent structures, some log cabins like Silas's, others built in styles she didn't recognize, with curved walls and reed-thatched roofs. Gardens sprawled around each dwelling, horses grazed in a central pasture, and everywhere people moved with purposeful energy. Silas guided the wagon down a switchback trail that opened into the heart of the settlement. People looked up as they approached, and Hazel braced herself for suspicion or hostility. Instead, hands lifted in greeting. Someone called Silas's name with obvious warmth. A child ran alongside the wagon, grinning up at them. Silas pulled to a stop near what looked like a communal cooking area, where several fires burned and pots bubbled with food that made Hazel's mouth water despite her nervousness. Silas Crow. The voice was deep and warm, belonging to a man who approached with the kind of presence that suggested leadership without demanding it. He was perhaps 60, his dark hair streaked with silver, his face deeply lined but kind. He wore simple clothes, buckskin pants and a cotton shirt, but carried himself with quiet dignity. "Tomas," Silas said, climbing down from the wagon. The two men clasped forearms in greeting. "Good to see you." "And you, old friend?" Thomas's eyes shifted to Hazel, still sitting frozen in the wagon. "And you've brought a guest." "This is Hazel," Silas said, offering his hand to help her down. "Hazel, this is Thomas Redleaf. He's the elder here." Hazel took Silas's hand and climbed down on shaking legs. She couldn't quite meet Thomas's eyes, but she managed a small nod. "Welcome, Hazel," Thomas said gently. "Any friend of Silas's is welcome at our fire."
I heard about you," said a woman who appeared from behind the cooking area, wiping her hands on her apron.
She was younger than Tomas, perhaps 40, with strong features and eyes that sparkled with intelligence. "You're the girl from Dustford." Hazel's stomach dropped. Here it came. The judgment, the whispers, the speculation about what kind of girl gets sold by her father. But the woman's expression held only sympathy. "Your father's a fool for not seeing your worth. We're glad you found safety with Silas." "This is Sarah," Tomas explained. "She runs the cooking, the garden coordination, and most of the common sense around here." Sarah laughed. "Someone has to. Come, Hazel, we can always use help with the food preparation if you're willing, or you can rest. You've had a long journey." The offer was genuine, Hazel could tell. Not an obligation disguised as invitation, but a real choice. "I'd like to help," Hazel said quietly. "If you'll show me what to do?" Sarah's smile widened. "Perfect. We're making fry bread and venison stew. Do you know how to work dough?" Hazel nodded, and just like that, she was drawn into the warm chaos of the cooking area. Women worked side by side, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they chopped vegetables, stirred pots, shaped bread. They talked while they worked, easy conversation about weather and gardens, children and upcoming harvests. No one asked Hazel invasive questions. No one stared at her with pity or disgust. They simply made room for her at the work table and showed her what needed doing. Hazel found herself kneading dough beside a young woman named Elena, who couldn't have been more than 20. Elena had a round, cheerful face and a laugh that came easily. "Your first gathering?" Elena asked. "Yes. I've never been anywhere like this." "It's special," Elena agreed. "Everyone contributes what they can, takes what they need. No money changes hands, just trade and trust." She shaped her piece of dough into a flat round with expert hands. "Some people say we're naive living like this, but I think the rest of the world's naive for thinking any other way works better." Hazel thought about Dustford, where every transaction was calculated, where kindness was weakness and generosity was foolishness. She shaped her own piece of dough, trying to match Elena's technique. "Silas is good people," Elena said suddenly. "Quiet, but solid. My Uncle Tomas says Silas is like bedrock. You can build on him and know he'll hold. He's been kind to me, Hazel said carefully. Kind is good, but more than that, he's honorable. That's rarer than you'd think. Elena placed her shaped dough on a wooden board. When he first came up to these mountains, we didn't know what to make of him. A white man building a cabin on the edge of our territory, we figured it meant trouble. But he came to Tomas right away, showed respect, asked permission even though he didn't legally need it. And he's kept his word about everything: water rights, hunting boundaries, mutual aid. That's worth more than gold. The afternoon unfolded in a blur of activity. Hazel helped cook, served food, cleaned dishes in creek water that numbed her hands. But she also watched and listened. She saw children playing without fear or supervision. She saw elders being treated with genuine respect, their stories listened to without impatience. She saw people who disagreed doing so without anger, finding compromise through conversation rather than confrontation. It was a different world than any she'd known. As evening approached, people gathered around a central fire. Someone brought out a drum. Someone else produced a fiddle that looked like it had survived several lifetimes. Music began, slow at first, then building to something complex and joyful. Hazel sat on a log near the edge of the firelight, content to observe. But Sarah appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of something that smelled like mint and honey. Tea, Sarah explained, sitting beside her. We sweeten it for celebrations. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching people dance. Even Silas was there, moving with surprising grace as he partnered with an elderly woman who cackled with delight whenever he spun her. He's different with you, Sarah said suddenly. Hazel looked at her, startled. Different how? Lighter, less weighted down. Sarah sipped her tea. We've known Silas for 8 years. In all that time, I've never seen him smile the way he smiled today when you successfully flipped that fry bread without burning it. Hazel felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm not that important. Maybe not to you, but grief is a peculiar thing. Sometimes it needs something specific to shift. For Silas, maybe you're that something. I don't want to be anybody's redemption, Hazel said quietly. Good, because that's too much pressure for anyone. Sarah turned to face her fully. But maybe you can just be someone who reminds him that life continues. That caring for people isn't always followed by loss. That opening his heart again won't necessarily destroy him. Hazel didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They finished their tea in silence, and then Sarah was called away to settle some dispute about whose turn it was to tell the next story. Tomas took her place on the log, lowering himself with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested such activities. Are you enjoying yourself? He asked. Yes, Hazel said, surprised to realize she meant it. Everyone's been very welcoming. We remember what it's like to be unwelcome elsewhere, Tomas said simply. Most of us here have been pushed out of somewhere. Towns that didn't want us. Land that was stolen from us. Communities that decided we didn't fit their definition of acceptable. So we built something new. He gestured to the settlement around them. It's not perfect. We argue. We make mistakes. But we try to treat each person as a person, not as a category or a problem. It's the least we can do. Silas said you have treaty land, Hazel said, that it's protected. We do. Not that treaties mean much in the long run. History has taught us that lesson over and over. But for now, yes, we have legal standing, and we use it to protect not just ourselves but others when we can. Silas's land borders ours. That gives him certain protections too. Thomas paused, his expression growing serious. Martha Keene told me about your father, about the rumors he's spreading. Hazel's hand tightened on her cup. I can't stop him from talking. No, but you can be prepared for what might come from that talk. Men like your father don't spread lies without purpose. He's building toward something. I know, but I don't know what to do about it. For now, nothing. Live your life. Let Silas teach you what he knows. But remember, you have friends here. If trouble comes, you don't face it alone. The words settled into Hazel's chest like a promise, warm and steady. The music shifted to something slower, more haunting. An older woman stood and began to sing in a language Hazel didn't understand, but the melody carried emotions that needed no translation, loss and longing and endurance. Silas appeared out of the darkness and sat on Hazel's other side. He didn't speak,
just handed her a plate of food and sat companionably close. They ate while the music washed over them. Hazel felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot she'd been carrying since the day on the porch in Dustford. Maybe before that. Maybe her whole life. Later, when the fire had burned low and children slept in their mother's arms, Tomas invited Silas and Hazel to stay the night. They were given a small guest cabin, simple but clean, with 2 beds and fresh linens that smelled like sage. Hazel lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the settlement at night. Somewhere, a baby cried and was soothed. Somewhere else, people laughed softly. The creek burbled its constant song. "Hazel!" Silas's voice came from the other bed, quiet in the darkness. "Yes? You did good today. Held your own. Made people feel at ease. That's a rare gift." Hazel's throat tightened. "I was terrified the whole time." "I know. That's what made it brave." She thought about that as sleep crept closer. Bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. Maybe she was braver than she'd thought. The next morning brought more food, more music, more connection. Hazel helped Sarah with breakfast, learning recipes that had been passed down through generations. She listened to stories told by elders, tales of transformation and survival that felt like they contained truths larger than their simple words suggested. And she talked with Silas, really talked, in a way they hadn't before. They walked along one of the creeks, following its meandering path through willows and wildflowers. "This place," Hazel said, gesturing to the settlement behind them, "it's different than anywhere I've been." "Different how?" "People here treat each other like they matter, like everyone has something to contribute, even if it's small." She paused, searching for the right words. In Dustford, everything was about what you could extract from someone. Here, it's about what you can build together. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "That's one way to see it. Another way is they've all been broken by the world outside, so they created a world that breaks differently." "Is that why you live near them? Because you're broken too?" The question was too blunt, too honest, but it was out before Hazel could stop it. Silas didn't seem offended. "Yeah, I guess that's exactly why. I couldn't fit in the regular world anymore. Couldn't pretend I was fine. Couldn't smile and nod and act like loss was something you just got over. So I came to a place where pretending wasn't required." He picked up a smooth stone from the creek bed and turned it over in his hand. "My wife's name was Catherine. My daughter was Lily. For a long time after they died, I couldn't even say their names out loud. Every time I tried, it felt like swallowing glass." Hazel waited, knowing this was important, knowing she needed to let him speak at his own pace. "Catherine was a teacher," Silas continued. "Taught reading and arithmetic to children in a one-room schoolhouse. She was patient with the slow learners, firm with the troublemakers, and she believed, really believed, that education could change lives." He smiled slightly at the memory. "Lily was 5, just learning to read herself. She'd follow Catherine around, trying to copy everything she did. Wanted to be a teacher, just like her mama." The smile faded. The sickness came fast. One day they were fine, the next day they were burning with fever. The doctor came, did what he could, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. He threw the stone into the creek, watching the ripples spread. "I wasn't there when they died. That's what I can't forgive myself for. I was 2 days away, working, earning money for a future that disappeared while I was gone. By the time I got home, they were already in the ground." "That wasn't your fault," Hazel said quietly. "I know that. In my head, I know that. But knowing and feeling are different countries, and I've never found the bridge between them." He looked at her directly. "When I saw you on that porch, being sold like you were nothing, I saw a chance to save someone. Couldn't save Catherine, couldn't save Lily, but maybe I could save you. Maybe that would mean something." It means everything to me," Hazel said, and her voice broke on the words. "Good, that's good." Silas started walking again, and Hazel fell into step beside him. "But I need you to understand, I didn't save you so you'd owe me something. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, and because I had the means to do it. That's all." They walked in silence for a while, the morning sun warming their shoulders, the creek singing its endless song beside them. "Can I tell you something?" Hazel asked, finally. "Something I've never told anyone." "If you want to."
When my father put me on that porch, part of me was almost relieved. Silas looked at her sharply, but didn't interrupt. Not because I wanted to be traded, Hazel continued quickly, but because at least it was honest. He'd been treating me like I was worthless my whole life, but pretending it was for my own good. Discipline, character building, tough love. But on that porch, he finally admitted the truth. I wasn't worth keeping, and in some terrible way that was almost better than the lies. She felt tears on her cheeks but didn't wipe them away. Does that make me broken? That I felt relief at being sold? No, Silas said firmly. It makes you human. Sometimes truth is better than pretty lies, even when the truth is ugly. At least you can work with truth. Lies just poison everything they touch. They reached a bend in the creek where wildflowers grew in riotous abundance. Hazel knelt and began gathering them. Lupine and Indian paintbrush, columbine and mountain aster. What are you doing? Silas asked. Making something beautiful. Because I can. Because I want to. She looked up at him, squinting against the sun. Is that okay? You don't need my permission, Hazel, but yes, it's more than okay. She wove the flowers into a loose arrangement, stems twisted together with the skill she'd learned making her mother's quilt. When she finished, she stood and held it out to Silas. For you, for everything. Silas took the bouquet carefully, like it was made of glass. His expression was complicated, gratitude and grief and something that might have been joy, all mixed together. Thank you, he said quietly. They returned to the settlement to find preparations underway for their departure. Silas loaded new supplies into the wagon, herbs from Sarah's garden, a repaired harness from the leather worker, news and messages to carry back to Martha. Tomas walked them to the edge of the settlement, his hand resting briefly on Silas's shoulder. You're always welcome here, both of you. Remember that. We will, Silas promised. The journey home felt different than the journey there. Hazel sat up front with Silas this time, watching the landscape change as they descended from Stone Creek territory back toward their own cabin. She felt fuller somehow, like the gathering had poured something into her that she hadn't known she was missing. But as they rounded the final bend toward home, Silas suddenly pulled the horses to a stop. What's wrong? Hazel asked. Silas pointed ahead, his face grim. There, nailed to the porch post of the cabin, was a piece of paper flapping in the breeze. They climbed down from the wagon and approached cautiously. Hazel could see writing on the paper, dark and official-looking. Silas pulled the notice down and read it, his jaw tightening with each line. What does it say? Hazel whispered. Silas handed her the paper without speaking. The words swam before Hazel's eyes, but certain phrases stood out with terrible clarity. Complaint filed by Calvin Rusk. Unlawful detention. Kidnapping of a minor. Sheriff's investigation. Required to appear. They're coming for us, Hazel said, her voice hollow. They're coming for me, Silas corrected. Your father's accusing me of taking you against your will. Says I forced the trade, says you're being held prisoner, says... He stopped, his face darkening. Says what? Hazel demanded. Says I've been inappropriate with you, that you're in moral danger. The words hit like a slap. Hazel felt rage flood through her, white hot and cleansing. That's a lie. That's all lies. I know. But lies told loudly enough become truth to people who want to believe them. Silas folded the notice carefully and put it in his pocket. We need to prepare. The sheriff's coming, probably within the week. And when he gets here, things are going to get complicated. They unloaded the wagon in tense silence. Hazel's hands shook as she carried supplies into the cabin. Everything she'd felt at the gathering, the peace, the belonging, the hope, crumbled like ash in her hands. That night, Silas sat at the table cleaning his rifle with methodical care. Not because he planned to use it, Hazel knew, but because it was something to do with his hands while his mind worked through possibilities and plans. I won't let them take you, Hazel said from the loft. Silas looked up at her, his expression sad. You might not have a choice. Then I'll tell them the truth. I'll tell everyone what really happened. The word of a 16-year-old girl against her father? Silas shook his head. The law doesn't tend to favor daughters over fathers, Hazel, especially when the father's telling a story people want to believe. What story is that?
that I'm a dangerous recluse who stole an innocent girl. It fits their narrative about mountain people being uncivilized. It justifies their fear and suspicion. Your father's giving them a villain they can understand. Hazel climbed down from the loft and sat across from him. Then we leave. Go somewhere they can't find us. Running makes us look guilty. And where would we go? I've got 40 acres here, a life I built. You think I want to abandon that? I think I don't want you in jail because of me. The words rang out in the small cabin, louder than Hazel had intended. She felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. Silas set down the rifle and reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. Whatever happens, it's not because of you. It's because your father's a cruel man who can't stand being shown up. This was always going to happen, one way or another. Then what do? We wait. We stay calm. We trust that truth matters, even when lies are louder. He pulled his hand back. And we prepare to fight if it comes to that. Not with guns. With testimony, with witnesses, with every scrap of proof we can gather that you're here by choice and you're safe. Hazel thought about Martha's warnings, about Tomas's promises, about the community at Stone Creek who'd welcomed her without question. We have friends, she said slowly. People who know you, people who'd vouch for you. We do, Silas agreed. And we'll need them, all of them. The week that followed was strange and tense. They continued their daily routines, milking goats, tending the garden, preserving vegetables for winter, but everything felt fragile now, temporary, like a dream about to shatter into waking. Hazel found herself watching the trail constantly, waiting for the sheriff's arrival. Every rustle in the forest made her jump. Every bird call sounded like a warning. On the 5th day, they came. Hazel was in the garden when she heard horses. She looked up to see 3 riders approaching, a man in a sheriff's badge, another in what looked like a deputy's vest, and Calvin Rusk, sitting his horse with the satisfied expression of a man about to collect on a bet. Silas emerged from the cabin, his face calm but his body tense. Sheriff? Silas Crow? The sheriff was a heavy-set man with a mustache that drooped over his mouth. He looked tired and irritated, like this was an inconvenience he hadn't asked for. That's right. I'm Sheriff Porter from Dustford. This here's Deputy Hayes. We need to talk about the girl. Calvin's eyes found Hazel in the garden. There she is. See, Sheriff? Just like I told you. Forced to work like a servant. I'm not forced to do anything, Hazel said, standing up. Dirt clung to her knees and her hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. I'm helping with the garden because I want to. That's what you'd say if you were scared, Calvin said smoothly. Hazel, honey, it's okay. You can tell the truth now. We're here to take you home. I am home, Hazel shot back. Sheriff Porter dismounted with a grunt. Miss Rusk, I need to speak with you privately, without Mr. Crow present. No, Silas said flatly. The deputy's hand moved to his gun. That wasn't a request, and I'm not leaving her alone with a man who sold her for a rifle, Silas replied, his voice level but hard as stone. If you need to speak with Hazel, I'll step back. But I won't leave this property. Sheriff Porter looked between them, then sighed. Fine. Mr. Crow, stand over there by the cabin. Miss Rusk, come here, please. Hazel's heart hammered as she walked toward the sheriff. Silas moved to the cabin porch, his eyes never leaving her. Now then, Porter said, his voice gentling slightly. I need you to tell me the truth, girl. Has this man hurt you in any way? No. Has he forced you to do anything against your will? No. Are you here because you want to be, or because you're afraid of what might happen if you try to leave? Hazel looked directly at Calvin. I'm here because Silas Crow saved me from a father who cared more about a rifle than his own daughter. I'm here because I'm safe. I'm here because for the first time in my life, someone treats me like I'm worth something. Calvin's face reddened. She doesn't know what she's saying. He's confused her, manipulated her. I know exactly what I'm saying, Hazel interrupted. You sold me. Publicly, in front of dozens of witnesses. You took money and goods, and you walked away without looking back. Don't you dare pretend you're here because you care about me. I'm your father. I have rights. You gave up those rights when you traded me like livestock. Hazel's voice rose, all the anger and grief of 16 years pouring out. You called me dead weight. You said I was worthless. You said no man would ever want me. And now you're angry because someone proved you wrong? Sheriff Porter held up his hand. That's enough. Mr. Rusk, did you or did you not trade your daughter to Mr. Crow in exchange for goods? Calvin's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. It was a private arrangement, a guardianship transfer, perfectly legal. Do you have papers showing this guardianship transfer? We didn't need papers. It was understood, so you sold her without legal documentation. Porter's expression hardened. And now you're claiming she was kidnapped? He took advantage of a vulnerable situation. You created that vulnerable situation, Hazel said, and her voice was cold now, distant. You put me on that porch. You set the terms. You took the payment. Silas just gave you what you asked for. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. Even he seemed to recognize the fundamental problem with Calvin's story. But Calvin wasn't finished. Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man for unlawful detention and bring my daughter back to Dustford where she belongs. Porter looked at Hazel. Do you want to go back to Dustford? No. Are you being held here against your will? No. Has Mr. Crow harmed you in any way? No. He's been nothing but kind and respectful. Porter turned to Silas. Mr. Crow, do you have any documentation regarding this arrangement? I have a bill of sale from Tom Nolan's general store, Silas said. Shows the rifle and flour I paid for. Also has Calvin Rusk's signature on it, acknowledging the exchange. It's inside. I'll get it. He disappeared into the cabin and returned moments later with a folded paper. Porter examined it, his frown deepening. This is signed and witnessed, he said to Calvin. You signed this. Under duress. By your own daughter's account, you're the one who initiated the whole thing. Porter folded the paper and handed it back to Silas. I don't see evidence of kidnapping here. I see a father who made a trade he's now regretting. Calvin's face went purple. You can't be serious. You're just going to leave her here with this hermit? She's 16, nearly 17, old enough to know her own mind. And she's made it clear where she wants to be. Porter mounted his horse. My advice is you accept the situation and move on. This isn't over, Calvin snarled. I'll go higher. I'll get a real investigation. You do that, Porter said wearily. But leave me out of it. I've got actual crimes to deal with. He nodded to Silas and Hazel, then turned his horse toward the trail. The deputy followed. Calvin remained for a moment longer, his eyes full of venom as he stared at Hazel. You're making a mistake, girl. When he tires of you, when he shows his true colors, don't come crying to me. Then he spurred his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the trees. The silence that followed was profound. Hazel stood rooted to the spot, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and released tension. Silas walked over to her slowly. You all right? I don't know, Hazel admitted. Is it really over? For now, but your father meant what he said. This isn't finished. Hazel looked at the trail where Calvin had vanished. Then we'll deal with it when it comes. Together. Together, Silas agreed. That night, Hazel couldn't sleep. She lay in the loft staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation over and over. Calvin's face, the sheriff's questions, her own voice, stronger than she'd known it could be. Below, she heard Silas moving restlessly, the creak of his chair, the soft sound of pages turning. He couldn't sleep either. Hazel climbed down the ladder quietly. Silas looked up from his book, the lamplight casting shadows across his weathered face. Can't settle? He asked. No, you. No. He closed the book. Come sit. No point both of us lying awake alone. Hazel sat in the other chair. For a long time, they just existed in comfortable silence, the cabin holding them like a shelter against the storm outside. Thank you, Hazel said finally, for standing up for me. You stood up for yourself, Silas corrected. I just stood nearby. Still, thank you. Silas nodded, his eyes distant. My daughter would have been about your age now. Sometimes I wonder what she would have been like, what kind of woman she'd have grown into. Tell me about her, Hazel said softly. Please. I'd like to know. And there, in the lamplight of a mountain cabin, as the night deepened around them,
Silas began to speak about Lily, about her laugh and her curiosity and the way she'd follow him around asking endless questions about how everything worked. He spoke about Catherine, too, about her strength and patience and the way she could make the hardest days feel manageable. Hazel listened, and in listening, she understood that grief wasn't something you got over. It was something you learned to carry.
And maybe, just maybe, sharing the weight made it bearable. When sleep finally came for both of them, the lamp had burned low and the first hints of dawn were touching the eastern sky. Whatever came next, they would face it together.
3 days passed in uneasy calm. Hazel threw herself into work with almost frantic energy, as if staying busy could keep her from thinking about what Calvin might do next. She weeded the garden until her fingers cramped, scrubbed the cabin floor until it gleamed, and reorganized the root cellar with meticulous care. Silas watched her with concern, but said nothing. He understood the need to control something when everything else felt uncertain. On the 4th morning, Martha Keene arrived on her mule looking grim. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, dismounting with a grunt. "All of us. Inside." They gathered around the table, and Martha pulled a crumpled newspaper from her saddlebag. She spread it on the wooden surface, smoothing the creases with calloused hands. "This ran in the Dustford Gazette 3 days ago," she said. Hazel leaned forward to read. The headline made her stomach drop. "Local father fights to rescue daughter from mountain captivity." The article was worse than she'd imagined. Calvin had given an interview portraying himself as a desperate father fighting against a corrupt system that refused to help him. He claimed Silas had manipulated the trade through threats and intimidation. He described Hazel as a confused child who'd been brainwashed into defending her captor. He even included quotes from unnamed concerned citizens who worried about what might be happening in the isolated mountain cabin. "This is insane," Hazel breathed. "None of this is true." "Truth doesn't matter when lies are printed in newspapers," Martha said flatly. "Calvin's building a narrative, and he's doing it smart. He's making himself the hero, Silas the villain, and you the victim who doesn't know she needs saving." Silas's jaw was tight. "What's his endgame?" "Best guess? He's working toward getting you arrested and Hazel declared in need of protection. There's talk of him filing for an emergency custody hearing in front of the circuit judge. Judge Bellamy's due through Dustford in about 2 weeks." "Bellamy's a reasonable man," Silas said. "He'll see through this." "Maybe, maybe not. Calvin's got public sympathy on his side now. People love a good rescue story, especially when it confirms their prejudices about mountain folk." Martha looked at Hazel. "You need to be prepared. They might try to take you back by force." "I won't go," Hazel said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You might not have a choice. If a judge orders it, they can compel you. And if Silas tries to stop them, he'll be arrested for interfering with a court order." The walls of the cabin suddenly felt too close, the air too thick. Hazel stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains that had become her sanctuary. "There has to be something we can do," she said. Martha and Silas exchanged a look. "There is," Martha said carefully, "but it means fighting Calvin on his own terms, building a counter-narrative, getting witnesses who will testify to what really happened on that porch." "Who'd be willing to do that?" Hazel turned from the window. "Everyone in Dustford saw what happened, but how many of them would actually speak against Calvin?" "More than you think," Martha replied. "Tom Nolan's already offered to testify. He's got the bill of sale, and he remembers Calvin's exact words that day. June Avery's willing to speak too. She heard everything. That's 2 people against an entire town that wants to believe Calvin's story." "2 honest people are worth more than 100 gossips," Silas said quietly. "But Martha's right. We need more. We need to prove not just that the trade happened, but that you're safe here, that you're thriving, not suffering." Martha reached into her bag again and pulled out a small journal. "I've been keeping medical notes on you since I first visited. Weight, general health, mental state. It's basic stuff, but it shows improvement across the board. You've gained 12 pounds of healthy weight. Your color's better, no signs of abuse or neglect." "You were documenting me?" Hazel wasn't sure whether to be grateful or disturbed. "I document everyone I treat," Martha said matter-of-factly. "It's good practice. In this case, it might also be good evidence." Silas leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "What about the Stone Creek people? Would Tomas testify?" "He already offered," Martha said. He's willing to bring treaty documentation showing your land is on the border of protected territory, which gives you certain legal protections. He'll also testify to your character and to the fact that Hazel was welcomed freely at their gathering. Calvin will just say they're lying to protect me, Silas pointed out. Probably. But it's harder to dismiss an entire community than one hermit. Martha's expression softened slightly. Look, I'm not going to pretend this is going to be easy. Calvin's got momentum, and he's playing dirty, but you've got truth on your side, and that counts for something. Does it? Hazel's voice was bitter. My whole life, I've watched truth lose to pretty lies. My father lied about why he hit me, said it was discipline. Lied about why he never let me go to school, said I wasn't smart enough. Lied about why he kept me working from dawn to dusk, said it built character. Everyone knew he was lying, but nobody cared because the lies were easier than the truth. Silence filled the cabin. Outside, a hawk cried, sharp and lonely. You're right, Martha said finally. Truth often loses, but not always, and this time we're going to fight like hell to make sure it wins. That afternoon, Martha rode back to Dustford with a mission: gather witnesses, collect evidence, and prepare for the custody hearing. Silas and Hazel were left to wait and wonder and try to maintain some semblance of normal life. But normal felt impossible now. Every sound made Hazel jump. Every shadow seemed like a threat. She found herself watching the trail constantly, expecting Calvin to appear with a mob or the sheriff with handcuffs. A week crawled by. Hazel's 17th birthday came and went unmarked except for a small cake Silas baked that turned out lopsided but tasted like honey and hope. They ate it in silence, both aware that turning 17 didn't magically grant Hazel legal independence. She'd still be considered a minor for another year, still subject to her father's authority in the eyes of the law. On the 10th day, a rider appeared on the trail. Hazel's heart leapt to her throat, but it was only a young man carrying a message. The circuit court would convene in Dustford in 4 days. Calvin Rusk had filed an emergency petition for custody. Silas Crow was ordered to appear and bring Hazel Rusk with him. What happens if we don't go? Hazel asked after the messenger left. They issue a warrant for my arrest and send men to bring you back by force, Silas said, reading the summons for the 3rd time. We have to go, but we go prepared. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Silas rode to Stone Creek and returned with Tomas and 2 other elders who agreed to make the journey to Dustford. Martha arrived with witnesses in tow: Tom Nolan, June Avery, and surprisingly, Old Pete from the livery, who claimed he didn't hold with selling children no matter what the law said. They made camp on Silas's property the night before the hearing, sharing food and stories around a fire that felt both comforting and ominous. Hazel sat between Silas and Martha, drawing strength from their solid presence. Tomorrow's going to be hard, Tomas said, his weathered face serious in the firelight. Calvin will paint a picture of you as a victim. People will want to believe it because it's simpler than the truth. What is the truth? Hazel asked quietly. That life is complicated. That sometimes the right choice looks wrong from the outside. That safety doesn't always come in pretty packages. Tomas poked at the fire with a stick. Your job tomorrow is to tell your story clearly and honestly. Don't let Calvin's lies make you doubt what you know. What if my story isn't enough? Then we tell ours too, Martha said firmly. You're not alone in this, Hazel. Remember that. They rode into Dustford at mid-morning, a small caravan that drew stares and whispers. Hazel sat in Silas's wagon, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles went white. The town looked exactly as she remembered, dusty, mean, and small. But she was different now, stronger, surer of herself. The hearing was set for the town hall, a squat building that also served as a schoolhouse and community center. People were already gathering, drawn by gossip and the promise of drama. Hazel saw faces she recognized: Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, the Avery sisters, ranch hands from the double bar. They all stared as she climbed down from the wagon. Calvin was there too, standing on the hall steps like he owned them. He dressed in his Sunday best and put on an expression of fatherly concern that made Hazel's stomach turn. "There's my daughter," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hazel, honey, you don't have to be afraid anymore. You're safe now." Hazel lifted her chin and looked him dead in the eye. "I was never afraid until you showed up." A murmur ran through the crowd. Calvin's mask slipped for just a moment,
showing the anger beneath. The circuit judge, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and an impressive beard, appeared in the doorway. "Everyone inside. We'll begin in 10 minutes." The hall filled quickly. Hazel found herself sitting at a table beside Silas, facing a simple bench where Judge Bellamy would preside. Calvin sat across from them with a lawyer he'd somehow managed to hire, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked around the rough hall with barely concealed disdain. Martha, Tomas, and the other witnesses sat in the gallery, ready to be called. The rest of the seats were packed with Dustford residents eager for entertainment. Judge Bellamy called the proceeding to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. "We're here to address the petition of Calvin Rusk regarding custody of his daughter, Hazel Rusk. Mr. Rusk, you've made some serious accusations. I've read your petition, but I'd like to hear the case in your own words." Calvin stood, and Hazel had to admit he looked the part of a concerned father. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter. My daughter was taken from me under false pretenses. This man," he pointed at Silas, "manipulated a situation to his advantage and has been holding Hazel against her will ever since. I'm asking the court to return my daughter to my custody where she belongs." "Mr. Crow, your response?" Silas stood slowly, his height and broad shoulders making the small hall feel smaller. "Your Honor, I didn't take Hazel against her will. Her father offered her in trade for goods from the general store. I accepted the trade, provided the goods, and Hazel has been living on my property since then of her own free will." The lawyer jumped up. "Your Honor, my client admits to making an arrangement, but he maintains it was done under duress and with the understanding that Mr. Crow would provide a proper home for his daughter, not keep her isolated in the wilderness." "Duress?" Silas's voice was hard. "What duress?" He named his price in front of dozens of witnesses. "My client was financially desperate. Then maybe he shouldn't have 4 children he can't afford to feed," Silas shot back. The judge banged his gavel. "Gentlemen, please, I'll hear from witnesses now. Mr. Rusk, call your first witness." Boss, Calvin called 3 people to testify, all of them painting the same picture. Calvin as a struggling father who'd made a mistake in a moment of weakness, Silas as a predatory recluse who'd taken advantage, and Hazel as a confused girl who needed to be rescued. None of them had actually witnessed the trade. None of them had visited Silas's cabin. They were testifying to feelings and assumptions, not facts. Then it was their turn. Tom Nolan took the stand first, his bearing straightforward and honest. "I was there that day. Calvin Rusk stood on my porch and announced he was trading his daughter for a Winchester rifle and 6 sacks of flour. Those were his exact words. He set the price. Nobody forced him." "Did he seem distressed?" the lawyer asked. "He seemed pleased with himself," Tom said bluntly, "like a man who'd made a good deal." June Avery testified next, describing the scene with painful clarity. "Calvin called Hazel dead weight, said no man in Dustford would want her, said she was just taking up space and eating food that could go to someone productive. Those aren't the words of a father trying to protect his daughter." Calvin's face reddened, but he stayed silent. Martha presented her medical documentation showing Hazel's improved health. Tomas brought treaty papers and testified to both Silas's character and Hazel's evident well-being at the Stone Creek gathering. Then Judge Bellamy did something unexpected. He looked directly at Hazel. "Miss Rusk, I'd like to hear from you, and I want the truth, not what you think anyone wants to hear. Do you understand?" Hazel stood on shaking legs. Every eye in the hall was on her. She felt the weight of their expectations, some hoping she'd condemn Silas, others hoping she'd vindicate him. But this wasn't about them. This was about her truth. "Your Honor, my father has never treated me with kindness," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "He's called me worthless since I was old enough to understand the word. He's hit me more times than I can count. He's told me I was stupid, ugly, useless. When he put me on that porch, he wasn't making a mistake. He was being honest for the first time in my life about what I meant to him." She paused, gathering strength. "Silas Crow didn't kidnap me. He saved me. He gave me a place to sleep where I don't have to be afraid. He taught me skills I never knew I could learn. He treats me with respect. And for the first time in my life, I feel like I matter." "Are you saying you want to stay with Mr. Crow?" the judge asked gently. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm saying I'd rather die than go back to my father's house." The words fell into absolute silence. Even Calvin seemed momentarily speechless. Then the lawyer found his voice. "Your Honor, This is clearly a case of Stockholm Syndrome. The girl has been conditioned to defend her captor. I know exactly what I'm saying, Hazel interrupted, her voice rising. I'm not confused. I'm not manipulated. I'm making a choice about my own life, and that choice is to stay where I'm safe. Judge Bellamy leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Mr.
Rusk, did you or did you not publicly offer your daughter in trade for merchandise?
Calvin's lawyer started to speak, but the judge held up his hand. I want to hear from Mr. Rusk himself. Calvin stood, smoothing his vest. Your Honor, It was a private arrangement, a transfer of guardianship. That's not what I asked. Did you offer her in trade? Yes or no? The silence stretched. Calvin's face worked through several expressions before settling on defensive anger.
I did what I thought it was best for everyone involved, he finally said. That's not an answer. Yes or no, Mr. Rusk? Yes, Calvin spat. But thank you. That's all I needed to know. Judge Bellamy shuffled through his papers. I've heard testimony from multiple witnesses that corroborates a public trade. I've seen documentation showing goods exchanged. I've heard medical testimony indicating the girl is healthy and well cared for. And most importantly, I've heard from the girl herself, who is nearly 17 and quite capable of expressing her preferences. He fixed Calvin with a hard stare. Mr. Rusk, you cannot trade away your daughter and then claim she was stolen. The law doesn't work that way. You made a choice, witnessed and documented. You cannot now undo that choice simply because you regret it, or because you've decided there's public sympathy to be gained. But, Your Honor, I'm not finished. The judge's voice was steel. Furthermore, based on testimony from multiple witnesses, I find your treatment of your daughter prior to this trade was neglectful at best and abusive at worst. Even if your current petition had merit, which it does not, I would be extremely hesitant to return a child to an environment where she was clearly not valued or protected. He turned to Hazel. Miss Rusk, do you feel safe with Mr. Crow? Yes, Your Honor. Has he ever harmed you or forced you to do anything against your will? No, Your Honor, never. Then my ruling is as follows. Calvin Rusk's petition for emergency custody is denied. Hazel Rusk will remain in the guardianship of Silas Crow until she reaches the age of majority. Mr. Rusk, you are ordered to pay court costs and are hereby prohibited from further contact with your daughter unless she initiates it. The gavel came down with finality. The hall erupted in noise, some people cheering, others protesting. Calvin lunged to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is a travesty. You can't. I can, and I have, Judge Bellamy said coldly. And if you continue to harass Mr. Crow or your daughter, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear? Two men had to physically restrain Calvin as he shouted obscenities. His lawyer tried to calm him, but Calvin shook them all off and stormed from the hall, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Hazel sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. She'd won. They'd won. Silas's hand found her shoulder, warm and steady. It's over, he said quietly. Is it really? The legal part is. The rest, he shrugged. We'll figure it out as we go. Martha appeared at their side, grinning broadly. Well done, both of you, especially you, Hazel. That testimony was perfect. Tomas nodded his approval. Truth spoken clearly is a powerful thing. They were surrounded then by well-wishers. Tom Nolan shaking Silas's hand, June Avery hugging Hazel with tears in her eyes, even old Pete offering his gruff congratulations. But through it all, Hazel kept watching the door where Calvin had disappeared, unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't really over. Men like Calvin didn't accept defeat gracefully. They stayed in Dustford that night at June Avery's boarding house. Hazel had a real room with a real bed, and June brought her tea and biscuits before bedtime, like Hazel was someone worth fussing over. But sleep didn't come easily. Hazel lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of town, horses in the street, voices from the saloon, the distant bark of dogs. She thought about Calvin's rage, about the look in his eyes as the judge ruled against him. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Hazel? You awake? It was Martha's voice. Hazel opened the door to find the healer standing in the hallway, still fully dressed. Can't sleep either? Martha asked. No. Want some company? They sat on the edge of Hazel's bed,
two women processing the day's events in comfortable silence. "I'm proud of you," Martha said finally. "What you did today took real courage. I was terrified the whole time." Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. Martha patted Hazel's hand. You stood up for yourself in a room full of people who wanted to tell your story for you. That's not nothing. Do you think Calvin will really leave us alone? Martha's hesitation told Hazel everything she needed to know. I think Calvin will do what Calvin always does, whatever serves Calvin's interests, Martha said carefully. But he's been publicly humiliated now. The judge ruled against him. He's got no legal standing anymore. That limits his options. But it doesn't eliminate them. No, Martha admitted. It doesn't. So you stay vigilant, you stay smart, and you remember you've got people who'll fight for you if needed. They sat together a while longer, then Martha squeezed Hazel's shoulder and left her to her thoughts. Hazel finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams full of courtrooms and mountains and her father's rage-filled eyes. She woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee drifting from downstairs. When she made her way to the boarding house dining room, she found Silas, Martha, and Tomas already eating breakfast. "Morning," Silas said, looking more relaxed than Hazel had seen him in weeks. "Ready to go home?" Home. The word settled warm in Hazel's chest. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They gathered their things and said goodbye to their witnesses. Tom Nolan pressed a package of sweets into Hazel's hands. June Avery made her promise to write occasionally. Old Pete just nodded gruffly, but looked pleased. The ride back to the cabin felt different than the ride down. The landscape hadn't changed, but Hazel had. She was no longer the girl who'd been sold on a porch. She was someone who'd fought for her own future and won. As they climbed into the mountains, leaving Dusford behind, Hazel felt something loosen in her chest. The legal battle was over. Calvin had no claim on her anymore. She was free. But freedom, she was learning, came with its own complications. Freedom meant choosing what came next. Freedom meant figuring out who she was when she wasn't defined by survival. Silas seemed to sense her thoughts. "You all right?" he asked as they neared the cabin. "I think so. It's just strange. Being able to decide my own life. Gets easier with practice," Silas said. "Though I won't lie, it's also terrifying sometimes. Knowing your choices are your own means living with the consequences when you choose wrong. What if I don't know how to choose? Then you start small." They arrived at the cabin as afternoon shadows stretched long across the clearing. Everything looked exactly as they'd left it. The garden thriving, the goats bleating their greetings, the chickens pecking industriously in their yard. Hazel climbed down from the wagon and stood for a moment just breathing it in. This was hers now, not by force or obligation, but by choice. The judge had said so. The law recognized it. She was home. "Hazel," Silas called from the porch. "Come look at this." She joined him to find a bird, a young hawk, lying near the door. It was breathing but clearly injured, one wing bent at an unnatural angle. "Must have hit the cabin," Silas said, kneeling beside it carefully. "Happens sometimes when they're hunting." "Can we help it?" "Maybe. Depends on how bad the wing is." He looked up at her. "Want to try?" Together they brought the hawk inside and made a makeshift nest in a box lined with soft cloth. Silas examined the wing with gentle hands while Hazel held the bird steady, feeling its rapid heartbeat against her palms. "Not broken," Silas said finally. "Just badly bruised. It might heal if we can keep it calm and fed for a few weeks." They spent the rest of the evening setting up a recovery area for the hawk, researching what it would need, preparing food it might eat. It was careful, purposeful work, and Hazel found it soothing after the stress of the past weeks. As night fell and they settled into their familiar routines, Silas in his chair with a book, Hazel in the loft with her sketches, everything felt right in a way it hadn't before. The threat was gone. The future was uncertain but full of possibility, and for the first time in Hazel's life, that felt like enough. The hawk died 3 days later. Hazel found it in the early morning, still and cold in its makeshift nest. She'd checked on it the night before and it had seemed stable, breathing steadily, accepting small pieces of meat from her fingers. But sometime in the darkness between midnight and dawn, it had simply stopped. She knelt beside the box for a long time, one hand resting on the bird's cooling feathers. It shouldn't have hurt this much. She'd only known the creature for 72 hours, but somehow the loss opened something raw in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the hawk and everything to do with the past months of her life. Silas found her there, her face wet with silent tears. "I thought we were helping it," Hazel said, her voice breaking. "I thought if we just tried hard enough." "Sometimes trying isn't enough," Silas said gently. He sat beside her on the floor, his presence solid and grounding. "Sometimes things are too broken to fix, no matter how much we want to save them." "Then what's the point? Why try at all?" "Because the trying matters. Because care matters, even when it can't change the outcome." He looked at the still bird with something like understanding. "That hawk spent its last days warm and safe instead of cold and alone. That's not nothing." Hazel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I hate this. I hate that everything good seems temporary. That you can't trust happiness because something always comes along to take it away." "That's true," Silas agreed. "But it's also true that sadness is temporary too. Pain passes. Grief softens. Nothing stays the same forever. Not the good, not the bad. That's both the blessing and the curse of being alive." They buried the hawk near the garden, in a spot where wildflowers grew thick in summer. Silas dug while Hazel held the small body wrapped in soft cloth. When the hole was deep enough, she placed the bird gently in the earth and stepped back. "Should we say something?" she asked. "If you want to." Hazel thought for a moment, searching for words that felt right. "Thank you for trying to live. I'm sorry we couldn't help you more. I hope wherever you are now, you're flying free." Simple words, but they felt true. Silas filled in the grave with steady movements, and when he finished, they stood together in the morning light, two people who understood that sometimes the smallest losses could teach the biggest lessons. The rest of that day passed quietly. They worked in the garden, harvested vegetables for preserving, tended the goats and chickens. But something had shifted between them, a deeper understanding, a recognition that they were both carrying griefs that couldn't be fixed, only lived with. That evening, Martha arrived with news from Dustford. "Calvin's gone," she announced, dismounting from her mule with visible relief. "Left town 2 days ago, packed up his boys and whatever he could fit in a wagon and headed west." Hazel's heart stuttered. "Gone? Just like that?" "Just like that. Seems the humiliation of losing in court was too much for his pride to bear. Plus people were starting to talk. Not about you, about him. About what kind of man sells his daughter." He couldn't stand being the villain in his own story, so he left to write a new one somewhere else. Silas crossed his arms. "He say where he was going?" "California, according to Tom Nolan. Something about land opportunities and fresh starts. But who knows if that's true? Calvin's relationship with truth has always been flexible." Hazel should have felt relief. Instead, she felt strangely hollow. "What about my brothers?" "Went with him. Didn't have much choice. They're younger than you and still under his control." Martha's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Hazel. I know they're not innocent in how they treated you, but they're still your brothers." "They stopped being my brothers a long time ago," Hazel said quietly. "When I was 8, I fell and broke my wrist. Calvin said I was making it up for attention. My brothers laughed and called me a liar. It was 3 days before the pain got so bad that Calvin finally took me to the doctor. By then, it had started healing crooked." She held up her left hand, showing the slight angle where the wrist had mended imperfectly. "This isn't from a fall. It's from being the kind of family where pain is dismissed and cruelty is normal. I hope they get away from him someday. I hope they learn to be better. But I'm not going to mourn losing people who never cared if I lived or died." Martha pulled Hazel into a fierce hug. "You're stronger than you know, girl." "I don't feel strong. I feel tired." "That's because strength isn't flashy. It's quiet. It's getting up every day and choosing to keep going even when giving up would be easier." Martha released her and turned to Silas. "Speaking of which, I've got a proposal for you both." They settled around the table with coffee while Martha laid out her idea. There was a family down in the valley, the Corbett's, whose youngest daughter needed schooling but couldn't make the long trip to Dustford every day. Martha had suggested that Hazel might be willing to teach her. "Just basic reading and arithmetic," Martha explained. "Nothing fancy. The mother's willing to pay in preserved goods and help with winter preparations. And it would give you a purpose beyond survival, Hazel. Something that's yours." Hazel's first instinct was to refuse. She wasn't educated enough to teach anyone. She'd barely had schooling herself, just bits and pieces stolen from her brother's lessons and whatever she could learn from books she'd found. But then she thought about Catherine, Silas's wife, who'd believed education could change lives. She thought about the children at Stone Creek, learning and growing in a community that valued knowledge. She thought about the person she might have been if someone had invested in her education instead of dismissing her as worthless. "I'll try," she said, "but I'm not promising miracles. I might be terrible at it." "Then you'll learn together," Martha said with satisfaction. "I'll let the Corbetts know. They'll bring Lucy up next week to meet you." After Martha left, Hazel climbed to the loft and pulled out her sketchbook. She'd filled nearly every page now with drawings of the mountains, the cabin, the garden, the animals. Her hand had grown surer over the months, her eye sharper. The early drawings looked tentative and uncertain. The recent ones showed confidence and skill. She turned to a fresh page and began sketching the hawk. Not as it had been in death, but as it might have been in life. Wings spread wide, fierce and free and beautiful. She worked by lamplight until her eyes grew tired, capturing every detail she could remember, every fierce curve of beak and talon. When she finally climbed into bed, she felt something settling inside her. The hawk was gone, but its memory would live in her drawings. Calvin was gone, but she was still here, still growing, still becoming someone new. Lucy Corbett turned out to be 9 years old with a gap-toothed smile and an endless supply of questions. She arrived the following week on a pony, accompanied by her mother, who looked anxious and hopeful in equal measure. "She's bright," Mrs. Corbett said, watching Lucy immediately befriend the goats, "but she's got no patience for sitting still, and I've got too much work to chase her through lessons." Hazel watched Lucy attempt to climb into the goat pen and felt a smile tug at her lips. "I think we'll get along fine." They started simple, letters and numbers on a slate board Silas had built. Reading primers borrowed from Martha. Arithmetic taught through practical problems. If you have 3 eggs and need to make breakfast for 4 people, how do you divide them fairly? Lucy was indeed bright and indeed impatient, but she was also hungry for knowledge in a way that reminded Hazel of herself. She asked endless questions about everything: why the sky was blue, how birds knew where to fly, whether numbers went on forever. Hazel didn't always have the answers, but she and Lucy learned to find them together in books, or through experimentation, or by asking Silas, who seemed to know an unexpected amount about an eclectic range of subjects. "How do you know about tree rings and weather patterns and the stars?" Hazel asked him one evening after a particularly wide-ranging conversation. "Had time to learn," Silas said simply. "When you live alone in the mountains, you either get curious about the world around you or you go mad from boredom. I chose curiosity." As summer deepened into late August, other families began hearing about the mountain girl who taught reading on a porch with a view of forever. A second student appeared, then a third. Hazel found herself teaching 4 mornings a week, and to her surprise, she loved it. She loved watching understanding dawn on a child's face when letters suddenly became words. She loved the practical challenges of explaining complex ideas in simple terms. She loved being needed for something other than hard labor. But more than anything, she loved the way it made her feel: competent, valuable, necessary. The opposite of everything Calvin had told her she was. One afternoon in early September, a stranger appeared on the trail. He was young, perhaps 25, dressed in city clothes that looked out of place against the mountain backdrop. He carried a leather satchel and had the eager expression of someone on a mission. "I'm looking for Hazel Rusk," he said, dismounting from a rented horse that looked relieved to stop climbing. Hazel stepped forward cautiously. "I'm Hazel." The man's face lit up. "Excellent. I'm James Mitchell, from the Territorial Post. I'm writing a story about unusual schools in the mountains, and I heard about your teaching enterprise. Would you be willing to answer a few questions?" Hazel glanced at Silas, who had emerged from the chicken coop. He gave a small nod. Her choice. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "Just about how you got started, what you teach, why you're doing this?" "Human interest stuff. My readers love stories about frontier education." They sat on the porch while James asked his questions and scribbled in a notebook. Hazel told him about teaching Lucy and the other children, about learning alongside them, about the practical challenges of mountain education. She didn't mention Calvin or the trade or anything that came before. That was her story to tell or not tell,
and she chose not. James left, promising to send her a copy of the article when it published.
Hazel thought that would be the end of it. A brief encounter, quickly forgotten. She was wrong. 3 weeks later, Martha arrived with a newspaper and a grin that stretched ear to ear. "You're famous," she announced, spreading the paper on the table. There, on the front page of the education section, was an article titled "Mountain Teacher Brings Learning to Remote Families."
It described Hazel's school in glowing terms, painted her as a pioneer of frontier education, and included a quote from Mrs. Corbett about how Lucy had gone from barely knowing her letters to reading simple books in just 2 months. "This is too much," Hazel said, reading and rereading the article with disbelief. "I'm not a pioneer, I'm just teaching a few children." "You're giving them something they wouldn't have otherwise," Martha pointed out. "That makes you pretty important in my book." The article brought unexpected consequences. Letters began arriving, forwarded through the Dustford post office. Some were from parents asking if Hazel could teach their children too. Others were from teachers in other remote areas, asking for advice and sharing their own experiences. One was from a newspaper editor in the territorial capital, inviting Hazel to write occasional dispatches about mountain life and education. "You should do it," Silas said when Hazel showed him the editor's letter. "You're good with words, and it's income that doesn't require breaking your back." "But what would I write about?" "Your life, the students, the mountains, the things you observe and think about." He smiled slightly. "You've already got pages of material in that sketchbook. Just translate the drawings into words." Hazel thought about it for 2 days before writing back to the editor with a tentative yes. Her first dispatch was about teaching Lucy to identify plants and trees, turning nature walks into living lessons. The editor published it the following week and asked for more. Slowly, carefully, Hazel began to build something that was entirely hers. The teaching grew. The writing became regular. She started getting paid. Not much, but enough to contribute to the household expenses and save a little for the future. She turned 17 in October, and this time they celebrated properly. Tomas and Sarah came from Stone Creek with gifts, a beautiful woven blanket, and a set of proper writing paper. Martha brought books and a bottle of elderberry wine. Even Tom Nolan made the trip, carrying a carved wooden box he'd made specially for Hazel's teaching supplies. They gathered around the fire, sharing food and stories and laughter. Hazel looked around at these people who'd become her family, not by blood but by choice, by shared struggle, by mutual care. "I want to say something," she announced when there was a lull in the conversation. Everyone turned to look at her. Hazel felt heat rise in her cheeks but pushed forward. 6 months ago, I was standing on a porch in Dustford being sold like livestock. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd always be worthless, always be the dead weight my father said I was. Her voice caught, but she kept going. "But you, all of you, you proved him wrong. You showed me that worth isn't determined by one person's opinion, that family isn't about blood, that home is where people treat you like you belong." She looked directly at Silas. "Especially you. You didn't save me because you wanted something from me. You saved me because it was the right thing to do. And then you gave me space to become someone new, someone I actually like being. I can never repay that." "You don't have to repay it," Silas said gruffly. "That's not how this works. I know, but I wanted you to know what it means anyway." Tomas raised his cup. "To Hazel, to second chances, to building lives worth living." They all drank to that, and Hazel felt tears on her cheeks. But this time, they were good tears, grateful tears, the kind that came from being seen and valued and loved. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the high peaks with fierce determination. Snow blanketed the mountains in thick silence, and the cabin became a warm haven against the cold. Hazel's students couldn't make the trip anymore, so she focused on her writing, sending regular dispatches to the newspaper about winter survival, mountain wildlife, and the quiet beauty of snow-covered forests. She also began work on something more ambitious, a longer piece about her own story. Not for publication, at least not yet, but for herself. A way of processing everything that had happened and claiming her own narrative. She wrote about Calvin's cruelty and her own resilience, about the trade and the terror of the unknown, about Silas's unexpected kindness and the slow building of trust, about the court hearing and the hawk and the way healing happened in small increments rather than dramatic revelations. The writing was hard, sometimes painfully so.
but it was also liberating. Each page she filled was a page she'd taken back from Calvin's version of her story. Each honest word was an act of defiance against everyone who'd told her she didn't matter. One evening in late November, she read portions of it to Silas. He listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "That's powerful," he said when she finished. "Honest in a way most people can't manage. Do you think I should try to publish it?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But yes, I think people need to read this. Not just the happy ending part, the whole journey, the ugly parts. The parts where you didn't know if you'd survive. Those are the parts that make the ending matter." Hazel thought about that. The happy ending did matter more because of what came before. The safety of the cabin meant something because she'd known real danger. The kindness of her chosen family resonated because she'd experienced cruelty from her blood family. She sent the piece to the editor in March when the snows began to melt and the first green shoots pushed through cold earth. He wrote back immediately, calling it the most important thing I've read all year and asking permission to publish it as a special feature. The piece ran in April under the title From Porch to Purpose, One Girl's Journey from Property to Person. It created a sensation. Letters poured in from women who'd experienced similar abuse, from men who recognized their own fathers in Calvin, from educators and reformers who saw Hazel's story as evidence that the laws around parental rights needed changing. Hazel read every letter, even the difficult ones. Some people called her a liar. Others said she was exaggerating or trying to gain sympathy. A few accused her of ingratitude toward the father who'd raised her. But far more people wrote to say thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth. Thank you for showing that survival was possible. Thank you for proving that people could change their stories even when everyone else had already decided how those stories should end. "You've started something," Martha said, visiting with a satchel full of forwarded mail. "People are talking about children's rights, about what parents should and shouldn't be allowed to do. There's even talk of new legislation." "I didn't mean to start anything," Hazel said. "I just wanted to tell my story." Sometimes that's all it takes. One person telling the truth loudly enough that others can't ignore it anymore. By summer, Hazel's little mountain school had grown to 8 regular students, and she'd hired Elena from Stone Creek to help with the teaching. They'd built a proper schoolhouse on Silas's property. Nothing fancy, just a single room with benches and a slate board and windows that looked out at the mountains. But it was theirs, built with lumber donated by families who believed in what Hazel was creating. On the opening day, parents and children filled the small space to bursting. Thomas said a blessing in his native language. Sarah brought enough food to feed everyone twice over. Tom Nolan donated books from his store. Even the circuit judge, who happened to be passing through, stopped to offer his congratulations. "You've done something remarkable here," Judge Bellamy told Hazel. "Built something lasting from something terrible. That takes courage most people never find." Hazel looked around at the schoolhouse, at the children eager to learn, at the community that had gathered to support this endeavor. A year ago, she'd been property. Now she was a teacher, a writer, a person who mattered. "It wasn't just courage," she said. "It was a lot of people choosing to care when it would have been easier not to." The judge smiled. "True enough. But you had to be worth caring about. And you had to let yourself be cared for. That's harder than most people realize." As the celebration wound down and families began heading home, Hazel found herself standing alone in the empty schoolhouse. She ran her hand along the smooth wood of a desk, feeling the solid reality of what she'd built. Silas appeared in his doorway, backlit by the setting sun. "You did good today," he said. "We did good. You built half this building." "I provided labor. You provided vision. There's a difference." He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. "I've been thinking about something." "What?" "My wife, Catherine, was a teacher. She believed education could change everything, could break cycles of poverty and ignorance, could give people choices they wouldn't otherwise have. Watching you do this, building this school, giving these children opportunities, I think she'd be proud. I know I am." Hazel felt her throat tighten. "That means a lot." "Good, because I want you to know, when I traded for you that day, I thought I was saving someone. But I think maybe you saved me too. Gave me a reason to care about the future again. Reminded me that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story." He cleared his throat awkwardly, uncomfortable with so much honesty. "Anyway, just wanted you to know that. You've become more than I expected.
Better than I hoped. Like a daughter, but also a partner in building something that matters. Hazel crossed the room and hugged him, really hugged him. Not the brief, awkward embraces of early months, but a full embrace of gratitude and love. You didn't buy me, she said quietly. You rescued me. And then you gave me room to rescue myself. That's everything. They stood together as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who'd found each other in darkness and built something luminous from the wreckage of their pasts. That night, Hazel sat at her writing desk in the loft and began a new piece. Not about trauma or survival this time, but about possibility. About the 1,000 small moments that had transformed her from property to person. About the community that had chosen to protect her. About the man who'd saved her and then stepped back to let her save herself. She wrote about the hawk that had died despite their care, and how even unsuccessful rescue attempts mattered. She wrote about teaching children whose families had been dismissed as ignorant, proving that brilliance existed everywhere if people bothered to look. She wrote about building a life from fragments and finding that the fragments could become something whole. As autumn arrived again, painting the mountains in fire colors, Hazel realized she'd been at the cabin for over a year. 12 months of transformation, of growth, of becoming someone she could barely recognize in the mirror. She was stronger now, both in body and spirit. Her hands were calloused from work, but also ink-stained from writing. Her mind was sharper, honed by teaching and learning in equal measure. Her heart was fuller, populated by people who chose to care rather than people obligated by blood. The newspaper editor wrote to say her pieces had been collected and would be published as a small book. Several reformers were citing her work in their arguments for changing custody laws. Her school had a waiting list of families wanting to send their children. But the most important change was internal and invisible. Hazel had learned that she was worth saving, worth teaching, worth listening to, worth the space she occupied in the world. On a clear October morning, Hazel stood on the porch and watched her students arrive, their voices bright with excitement about the day's lessons. Silas was in the garden, harvesting the last of the tomatoes before the first hard freeze. Martha was expected later with supplies and news. Elena was inside the schoolhouse, preparing for the day's arithmetic lesson. Everything was ordinary and extraordinary at once. Just another day in a life that had seemed impossible a year ago. Hazel pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing the scene before her. The students, the mountains, the cabin that had become home. Her hand moved with confidence now, capturing not just what she saw, but what she felt. When she finished, she wrote beneath the drawing in careful letters, "Home isn't where you're born. Home is where you're finally treated like you belong." Simple words, but true. The truest thing Hazel had ever written. She closed the sketchbook and walked toward the schoolhouse, toward her students, toward the future she was building one choice at a time. Behind her, the mountains rose eternal and indifferent. Ahead, 8 children waited to learn how letters became words and words became power. Hazel Rusk, once property, now person, opened the door and stepped into her life. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.